All right, we are back again with another episode in this series. Uh, I'll have to say this book is it kind of tests your patience a little bit because there are certain chapters that are too detailed and while actually I'm reading these books, I'll have to just divert a little bit and then again go to Google out some things, read about that particular thing, and then again start reading this book. All right. So, a word of caution for people who want to read this book. It's sufficiently detailed for somebody who wishes to dive deep into the history and culture of this holy land of Bharat. But, like I said, if you're not a hardcore reader and if you're fond of reading books with colorful pictures and graphics, then I would say this is not for you. All right. Okay, so welcome back to another episode in this series of Ancient History of Bharat. My name is Harsh. Like everybody else, I have studied in a normal CBSE school, to be very specific, Kendriya Vidyalay. So I have been exposed to, to people who are nationalists, to my teachers who are also nationalists, and but that is not the story in private schools. Most of the private schools in our country today, and especially the ones that claim to be from the international board, okay, they teach something else in the name of history. They'll say that they are teaching history, but they are actually a propaganda machinery for the global left or the global liberal left, I would say. But that is again, a lot of YouTubers, and even there are several politicians who have spoken about this. So anything I'll say will not do any good to that particular cause. But right now, we are going to talk about chapter number 21, and the name of that chapter is Political and Legal Institutions. Okay, first of all, let me just give you a brief background about what exactly is a political institution. Okay. Parliament, the current parliament that we have, is a political institution. Lok Sabha is a political institution. Okay. Courts that we have, the Supreme and the High Courts that we have, are legal institutions. Okay. Now these are largely based on any normal student of history would know that we have adopted the parliamentary system of democracy, and thanks to the British, we follow their way of democracy. And this is for you to think, why exactly did we end up with their kind of a democracy? Even if we have adopted their kind of democracy, why don't we make certain modifications and changes? Okay, but that would again be a different discussion. All right, so yeah, those are political institutions. Legal institutions are those that are the arbitrators or the arbiters of justice. Okay, so those are legal institutions, the high courts and the supreme courts. But like I said again, our high courts and our judiciary functions on the English common law and anything. But yeah, these discussions, a lot of people before me have had these discussions about how we need modifications, specifically based on the law of Bharat and not the English civil law or the English common law. Okay, but that is again besides the point. A lot of people have spoken about it, but despite of understanding everything else, if you speak with a teenager these days, that particular teenager understands, okay, whatever that we have right now has been adopted from the British. Everything is Christianized. There are widespread conversions going on left, right and center. There are other schemes going on such as love jihad and whatnot. Okay, everybody knows that these things are a norm. My problem is nobody really cares to speak about these things. Okay, you know why nobody speaks about these things? Because if you speak up about these things, first of all, you will not be allowed to exist on social media. Okay, because there are forces, that make sure that nobody from the other side of the argument rises up. All right. Yeah. So today we are going to talk about the political and legal institutions in our country as mentioned in this book by RC Majumdar. For those of you who want to read this book, buy this book. It's available on Amazon. You can read it, you can study it, and you will come across some startling revelations about the culture and the history of this country. Some things, they have been taught and they are blatant lie. Alright, so let's study. On page number 429, RC Majumdar, he starts off by saying, the political theories are sometimes discussed in connection with the gods, whose thoughts and activities are, however, so much akin to those of men, that no great stretch of imagination is required to interpret the views as equally or really applying to human affairs. Okay, now here the political theories that you find in the Brahmanas, when I say Brahmanas, I mean the literary texts, okay, not the priestly class. Alright, so in those texts, whenever you find political theories, they usually deal with even the gods as well. So even the gods were not exempt from all these political principles that the Brahmanas mention. Okay. Brahmana text anticipates writers on polity of a later period by clearly formulating the question. Okay, now there was a question, how is it that the king who is one rules over so many subjects? Okay, this has been a very old question. Okay, how is it? You might have come across this question. Okay, if there is a king, okay, and that king is a single ruler, so why exactly is he ruling over so many people? Isn't he just one person? What is the answer to this question? Okay, believe it or not, 5,000 years ago the Brahmanas, they give answer to this question. Okay, it's just that we have not cared enough to read these texts, and we have been ignorant enough to just simply let it go. Alright, now there are some notes. Alright, the first in point of importance is the view put forth in the Aitreya Brahmana. It is said that the gods and demons fought with one another, but the gods were defeated. The gods said, it is because we have no king that the demons defeat us. So let us elect a king. This is written in the Aitreya Brahmana 5,000 years ago. Okay, they elected a king and through his help obtained complete victory over the demons. Okay, here the kingship originates in military necessity and derives its validity from the consent. Okay, now there are two different principles over here. Number one is the idea of kingship, as in we need somebody to lead the country. In the modern, I'll not use that word, in the contemporary world, okay, who is the successor of this office of kingship? Okay, it has to be the president or the prime minister of any given country, okay, because that person is in charge. Now that person derives its authority, or why did we need the office of king in the first place? It was military necessity. Somebody had to protect the territory over which people resided. Okay, that is point number one. Number two is it derives its validity from the consent. Okay, for those of you who are students of politics and students of political science, you might have heard this name of John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher. He came up with this theory of there is this contract between you and the state. Okay, you vote them into power, okay, and then you get into a contract with them, and they in turn promise to protect you back and give you some rights as well. Okay, this is the social contract theory that John Locke came up with, who is the an intellectual forefather for democracy, parliamentary democracy, the way it is the way it functions in the West. Okay, now that particular theory was given in the Aitreya Brahmana. Okay, it says the kingship derives its legitimacy through two necessities. Number one is a military necessity, as in you need somebody to lead the forces at the time of war. Secondly, the validity of these forces or the legitimacy of these forces comes through consent. It is the people who give their consent to the king to fight on their behalf. Alright, now I'm not going as far as saying that this is the germ of democracy. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is just merely a principled approach. Okay, if had we been a little bit prudent while applying the principles of democracy, okay, things might have turned out differently. but that is again discussion for some another video. Alright, so yes, the idea of consent, and hence we vote. Why do people vote? Why does voting matter in a democracy? Because you are giving your consent to a party, and by that extension you are giving your consent to an individual candidate, that you can rule on behalf of us. Okay, you can lead the forces militarily. So these were the two primary reasons why the office, or why did the idea of kingship rise, as in you needed somebody to take those decisions. Okay, now as in when the world progresses, as in when the culture or the civilization develops, okay, there are bound to be corruptions. Okay, so initially the office of king was not exactly hereditary. Okay, king, because we don't exactly have evidence to prove contrary to it, so we cannot just assume that kingship was hereditary all this while. Okay, because the Brahmanas and the Vedas, both of them send confusing signals. We don't exactly know whether the office of king was hereditary or not, but we simply cannot assume that. Since there is no mention, let us assume that it's hereditary. Alright. Next up, on page number 430, RC Majumdar writes that it says in the Aitreya Brahmana about the Indra's kingship, the gods headed by Prajapati said to be one another, this one is among the gods the most vigorous, the most strong, the most valiant, the most perfect, who carries out best any work. Let us install him in the kingship. Okay. Now here some priest is chanting this hymn. Okay, that somebody from amongst the gods is the most perfect, is the most vigorous, is the most strong, the most valiant, and gets things done. So let us install him in the kingship. Okay, now there are also some theories in our public discourse and in the folklore of our country that Indra was rather a title for somebody who was too good of a king. Somebody was too good as an individual and displayed certain characteristics to qualify as a king. Okay, so Indra might well have been a title as well. Okay, so this quote says that there was some element of consent between the populace and the king. Okay, it was the people who were putting a king on that throne. Gradually, over a period of time, with perversion and all and whatnot, it might have become hereditary, but almost certainly the beginning of the office of kingship was never supposed to be hereditary. Okay. Here again, the kingship originates in election and common consent based on the possession of highest qualities by the chosen candidate. What were the highest qualities? We will cover that in a few moments, but yes, in one of our previous videos we had discussed, if you had to reach the epitome of manhood, okay, as in if you had to reach the epitome of your manhood, you need to excel at both the fields. One is you need to have a martial spirit. Secondly, you're supposed to be well versed in the Vedas and all the knowledge systems that we had. This was one of the requirements for you to gain respect, for you to reach the epitome of your manhood. Okay, so simply just having raw brute strength was never one of the was never just because you should know this by now with your living experience, that raw strength standalone is never appealing. Okay, it's a healthy mixture of both that is appealing to people. All right. Next is, but side by side with rational views, we also find the theory of the divine origin of kingship. Even in the Rig Samhita, in the Mandala 4, hymn number 42, okay, Puru King Trasadasyu, okay, Rig Samhita, okay, 5,000 years ago in Mandala 4, in the hymn number 42, mentions that there was a Puru king who goes by the name of Trasadasyu. Okay, Trasadasyu, he says this, okay, he says this in first person, that I am Indra, I am Varuna, and again on me bestow those principal energies characteristic of the Asuras. Okay, Now here he is speaking in first person. He's saying, I am this, I am that, and hence give me these qualities. Okay. Now here RC Majumdar says that this is the evidence that there was a divine origin of the kingship. All I would say is this is just some individual who is staking his claim towards kingship. Okay. This in a way is also an evidence of, democratic election of a king, because why did he have this urge of speaking in first person and establishing his credentials to others? But yes, all these things are open to interpretation because they have been written far back in time. So I would leave it to your better judgment. What could this mean? All right. Next up is the king is declared to have gained identity with Prajapati by virtue of the Vajpaya and the Rajasuya sacrifices. The Satpatha Brahmana definitely declares he, the Rajanya, is the visible representative of Prajapati. Now Prajapati is Indra, the lord of the creatures. Hence, while being one, he rules over many. This is also an argument in the favor of this theory that kingship, the office of king, was indeed divine. Okay, it was heavenly ordained. It was not something that humans created out of their own mind and chose to elect a king through popular vote. Okay, keep in mind we are not talking about the 18th or the 19th century. We are talking about 5,000 years ago. Okay. So cut them some slack if they were not, they do not fit into your perfect definition of a democracy. This is 5,000 years ago we are talking about. Okay. Reference may be made in this connection to the short passage in Satpatha Brahmana. Whenever there is drought, then the stronger seizes the weaker, for the waters are the law. This is something interesting that was written in the Satpatha Brahmana. It says, whenever there is a drought, then the stronger seizes the weaker. Who's to say Charles Darwin did not read this and then come up with the theory of survival of the fittest? Now I'm not saying that he read this and came up with it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying these things were written down 5,000 years ago. Okay, and there is no acknowledgement or credit for these things. Whenever we talk about these things, they are simply just belittled and disparaged as superstitions and useless things. Okay. So it says over here, whenever there is a drought, then the stronger seizes the weaker, for the waters are the law. Okay. I'm not taking anything away from Charles Darwin, but from this point forwards, I'm going to believe that it is Satpatha Brahmana that came up with this idea of survival of the fittest, not Charles Darwin, or whoever who is allegedly claimed to have come up with that idea of survival of the fittest. Okay. Next up was the political speculations. On page number 430, he writes, rapid increase in number as well as size of the Aryan kingdoms in Bharat and the consequent growth of power and majesty of the ruling chiefs, who had mostly outgrown the stage of tribal leaders and became territorial monarch. Okay. Now what do you do after you've made your transition from the hunter-gatherer to a settled civilization? Now that you had leisure and time, okay, you were either waging a war or planning to wage a war. Okay, you were accumulating and clubbing all those lands, and because power begets power. Once you have tasted victory, you want more and more of it. Okay, so eventually the tribal leaders, they transformed into monarchs because they had accumulated so much of a land and so much of wealth that they could qualify as a kingdom. All right. On page number 431, Vedic texts testifying to the amalgamation of early Rigvedic tribes into more powerful political units. The Purus and the Bharatas became united under the name Kuru. The Turvasas and the Krivis became Panchalas. And lastly, there was clear hints about the amalgamation of these two into Kuru Panchala group. Okay. So slowly and steadily, all the tribal leaders, they were fighting each other, they were clubbing their powers, they were signing treaties, and eventually when there somebody rose up to prominence with such large amount of territory, they could call themselves as monarchs, and this is how the individual kingdoms came up. Okay. Again on page number 431, RC Majumdar writes, The fact that kings are often described in the Atharva Veda as fighting with their cousins or with their non-Aryan enemies has been taken to confirm this view. This is, however, hardly conclusive. Aitreya Brahmana tells us that kings in the east were called samrats. Okay, again, this is Aitreya Brahmana, 5000 years ago, somebody is writing this. That the kings in the east were called samrats. Is it a coincidence? Why do we call Ashok Samrat? We call it as Samrat Ashok. So the kings in the east, okay, were called samrats. Those in the south were called bhojars. Those in the north were called virats, and those in the famous middle country were merely rajans. And the titles like Ikarat or Sarvabhauma could be claimed by a king who had conquered the kings in all the four directions. Alright. So these tribal leaders, it was not just limited to this area of current day Punjab in both the countries, Bharat and Pakistan as well. Okay. So these kingdoms had come up as far as the east, as far as the Odisha and the Bengal coast of the current day. Okay, kingdoms had come up as far as that land, and they had some titles for themselves as well. Alright. Interesting. Next up on page number 432, RC Majumdar writes in Satpatha Brahmana Mandala 12, hymn number 9, and also in the Aitreya Brahmana Mandala 8, hymn number 12. Okay, Brahmanas speak of Dasa Purusham Rajyam, kingdom of 10 generations, and as a royal descent can be traced in several other cases. The monarchy may be said to be normally hereditary. The term Rajaputra, which can be interpreted as king's son, in the majority of its occurrences in the texts of this period, bears testimony to the same fact. Like I said, that some kingdoms, because we don't have definite proof, alright, somewhere you will find evidence in the Brahmanas and even in the Rig Samhitas as well that indeed the office of king was an elected one that was elected by popular vote. In other verses, you will see that some of the kingdoms had a hereditary lineage. Okay, so there is no one way, there is no one answer to this question of whether the office of king was hereditary or not. Okay, but the mere fact that the quote that we read a few seconds ago about the stronger seizes the weaker, who's to say that the mass of the population or the people, who were reading all these things, they were not inspired by such sentiments? Because if these sentiments existed, there were people who were bound to internalize these sentiments and act upon it. Okay. Let's see what else RC Majumdar has to write. This says monarchy and popular assemblies are placed on the same footing as divine institutions according to the Satpatha Brahmana. Again, it says the same thing. Monarchy and popular assemblies. Popular assemblies as in meaning people in those assemblies, were there after some sort of a consent. We cannot assume that 5000 years ago they had some scheme such as voting for these things. So they might have been elected through some vote, or they might have had consent. We don't exactly know, but in the Satpatha Brahmana it says monarchy and popular assemblies, both of them are at par with each other. None of them is above the other. Other passages in the literature of this period also indicate that the king took particular care to be in the good grace of the assemblies, and the loss of their favor and support was regarded as a dire calamity for him. Okay. There is something that is very controversial over here, but I will not say it just because I don't want to be controversial. Okay. The Maitrayani Samhita. There is the corpus of the Aryan literature is very wide. So there is one more book that goes by the name of Maitrayani Samhita. It tells us that women did not attend the Sabha, which is but expected as women did not take part in political activity. Okay. So 5,000 years ago, it says women did not take or women did not participate in the political ongoings of the state. Okay, that's not my opinion. That is what Maitrayani Samhita says. Okay. The Sabha thus appears to be an active institution housed in a place where legal rather than political business was more transacted, and which also served as a venue of social gatherings and games. It is difficult to distinguish clearly between the functions. So Sabha and Samiti had interchangeable functions. Both of them did something, and yep, it's hard to distinguish. Okay. Hostility was tacit. Hostility was a normal relation between the two states, and the king had necessarily to be a great warlord, endowed with ample military resources. These requisites of kingly office are reflected in a hymn of the Atharva Veda. Okay, king was somebody who was expected to be firm. Okay, you cannot have a soft leader. Okay, in the contemporary world, you will see countries who have formidable leaders. Okay, they will have a higher standing in the committee of the current day nation states. Okay, a leader can never be soft. This is something that is mentioned in the Atharva Veda. Besides, one fundamental principle which characterizes the political thought of the Aryans is the conception of dharma, or the sacred law that sustains the universe, and to which both the king and all the sections of the community owe allegiance. Okay, the conception of dharma is something that we like to call, or we call it as dharma. It is a cosmic law. Okay, it is a clock that was started by our gods. That clock is still ticking. Okay, you cannot diverge or divert from the commands of the dharma. Okay, that is impressed upon you, that is expected from you. So so the king owes its allegiance. King and the people who have elected that king, both of them owe their allegiance to dharma. The sages, not the king, had the power to interpret this law, which was included in the sacred canon, and it was clearly recognized duty of the king to abide by and give effect to it. Okay, here is the inception of the idea of the Brahminical oppression, because it was only the priests who were allowed to interpret the cosmic law. Okay, it is what it is. I am not going to hold back punches. It's written over here. You can pick up this book and read it. In assessing the true character, beneficent or otherwise, of kingly rule in his age, we must take note of high intellectual qualification of the kings. Okay, like I said, if you wanted to be a man, or if you wanted to reach the epitome of your manhood, you just need not be physically strong. You also have to be equally, okay, if not more, you also have to be equally mentally strong. And when I say mentally strong, I mean both logically and emotionally. Okay, so many of the kings were well versed, if not more than the Brahmanas, in the Vedas and the Upanishads. They took great interest in philosophical discussions. Such highly cultured kings must have generally proved benevolent rulers. So all of the people out there who are only sharpening one side of the saw, okay, this is inherent inside all the men who are born. Okay, they want to reach the top of their power, like they want to accumulate a lot of power. Okay, if indeed that is the aim of your life, you cannot just focus on physically being strong. You have to focus on your intellectual side as well. So all the kings who ruled at those times, they were not just physically strong, they were also mentally strong. They were well versed in the Vedas and the Upanishads. Okay, it's written over here. I am not making these things up. Yeah, right now it's thanks to a lot of content creators. Manhood is simply just limited to who can lift the maximum number of weights who can do the maximum number of push-ups, who can punch the hardest. That is what the social media has limited the manhood to. Okay, and the situation is far worse in the Western countries. You cannot talk about manhood so publicly. Frequent references. Okay, now we move on to the administrative side. This was just simply the political side of how the state functioned. Okay, now it's about the administration. Okay, what was the actual groundwork? Who did the groundwork? Frequent references to a large body of royal officials indicate development of administrative systems. So there was some sort of an administrative infrastructure that was put in place. Okay, because administration of such large kingdoms cannot function merely on simply just talking on a day-to-day basis. You need a permanent structure in place. Okay, and it indeed was. There is above all the Purohita, who was something like an archbishop. Again, I don't condone the use of this word archbishop. You cannot equivalent Christianity with the Aryan way of life. Those are two different things. Okay, and also a counselor of the king. Okay, now there are certain professions that are mentioned that was very interesting for me to know, because I did not know this previously before reading this book. One of the profession that is over here is the charioteer. Okay, you might think that being a charioteer during those times was simply just driving the chariot for any king and that would just be it. No, that particular job involved a lot of other things as well. Let's see what those things involved. Okay, and that charioteer was called Suta, S-U-T-A, Suta. Okay, the important role of the Suta plays as the herald or minstrel in propagation and popularization of heroic and epic poetry. Okay, I don't know what these people are called in other states, but in our state of Gujarat, we have a certain community of people. They call themselves Charans. Charan, Charan. Okay, that is a community of poets, highly learned poets, people who have been gifted with a good voice. All right, now they were the people who were tasked with this job of propagation and popularization of heroic and epic poetry. They were the ones who were charioteers for kings. Okay, they had a fund of stories and worldly wisdom. They possessed a lot of stories. I am assuming that these stories would have carried on hereditarily, from father to the son in the form of oral traditions. Okay, and this also, it's written over here, I am not making these things up, on page number 436. It is written over here: one need but remember the vital part played by the charioteer in the Bhagavad Gita, the world's most famous charioteer. Okay, I need not name him, you guys already know who I'm talking about. Okay, yep, Shri Krishna. Alright, so yes, the charioteer played a very big role for the kings. Next is the descriptions of the Rajasuya, the royal consecration, in the later Samhitas and the Brahmanas depict the king as the protector of the people in general and in the Brahmanas in particular. In return for this protection, the king is allowed to live on the income of the subjects. Okay, now here is the conception or the inception of the idea of the social contract theory that John Locke came up in, centuries and centuries later, after it was written down in the Brahmanas, the literary texts. It says over here, what was the justification behind allowing the king to rule over the masses? He was providing protection, and in return or as a payment for that protection was the taxes that the subjects paid. What is this? This is a social contract. Okay, John Locke, buddy. Yeah, let's keep it at that, because there are people in the West who are very much fond of John Locke and his theories. But I'm not really sure, was it really Kant or John Locke who came up with this theory of social contract? Okay, so if I've made an error, you can comment on this video and let me know. It was either Immanuel Kant or John Locke, social contract theory. I'm not really sure. but it's there in our Brahmanas. The Brahmanas also claim to be exempt from the normal exercise of royal authority. Now I am talking about the priestly class, okay? Particularly in respect of taxation. In the Rajasuya ceremony, the priest tells the assembled people, okay? Now the Rajasuya ceremony is basically you'll conduct a sacrifice and you will coronate a new king. That was what the Rajasuya sacrifice was. Whenever there was somebody else who was taking over a throne, that person would undertake a Rajasuya sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, after officiating at the sacrifice, the priest would make this announcement. Okay, let's hear it. It's written in inverted commas on page number 437. This man is your king. Soma is the king of us Brahmanas. Okay, so you can see over here as well, the priestly class was even above the kings. This is 5,000 years ago. Okay, there are also some crimes that were, recognized at that time. Now we are talking about the law and legal institutions. It's given on page number 438. Okay, what were some crimes that were common during those times? How do we know that? Because there are some punishments that are described for these crimes. So these might have been common. Okay. Among the crimes enumerated or otherwise recognized are theft, robbery, adultery, incest, abduction, killing of an embryo, the killing of a man, and the slaying of a Brahmana, which alone amounts to murder proper and is expiable by the performance of the Ashwamegha. Drinking intoxicating liquor, treachery, punishable by death. So all these things find mention. Private vengeance was also permitted. This is RC Majumdar writing. Okay, so private vengeance was also permitted to serve the ends of justice. Though the crudities of such procedures were held in the considerable check by the system of Vairadeya, the money to be paid for killing a man as a compensation to his relatives. Okay, so there was also some sort of a private vengeance. Okay, so if you have some sort of a dispute or a grievance with an individual, okay, you are permitted to execute a private vengeance, provided that you give a certain amount of money to the individual's relatives as a compensation for having killed that person. The punishments for crime were rather severe. If a thief was caught red-handed, death or cutting off of hands was a penalty in milder cases. Binding to posts and the return of stolen goods sufficed as punishment. Okay, so there are people out there who will constantly regurgitate this idea that, see, look at the countries in the West Asia, how do they punish their people? They chop off people at the crossroads. If somebody is caught thieving something, they'll cut down their hands. It's written 5,000 years ago in our Vedic texts. And this is not me saying it. If you really are a stickler for evidence, you can read this book. Individual property or individual ownership in land for the purposes of cultivation was recognized. Okay, capitalism, if I may use that word, but that is a very controversial word. I would not use that. But yes, individual property or individual ownership of property was something that was allowed. It wasn't frowned upon. Here is again a controversial thing. Women were excluded from inheritance or partition. Neither they nor the Shudras had any right to property. There is not much information available regarding the legal relations of husband and wife after marriage. The husband in all probability claimed the wife's dowry and earnings, if any. The Satpatha Brahmana says women own neither themselves nor an inheritance. Okay, keep in mind, you need to view this with the same degree of empathy with which you view other belief systems, especially the monotheistic traditions. Okay, so if you are very quick to judge this, then there are also other cases to be discussed. How other religions treated women thousands of years ago. Some of them still continue with the same treatment. Alright. That's it. We have reached the end of this chapter. Next chapter is chapter number 22, and that goes by the name of religion and philosophy. We will not discuss that chapter today. We'll discuss that chapter in the next video. Alright, that's all for this video. I hope you are enjoying it. And if you are not enjoying it, I would really recommend to start your own journey of learning about your own country. Okay, the history and culture of Bharat, and you will be surprised to know the amount of lies, some of them even blatant lies, that were taught to us in the name of history in our schools. Okay, but if you don't have time, if you're somebody who is a working professional, who has other things to tend to, okay, you can subscribe to my channel. You can regularly watch my videos, because this is what I'm doing. I myself is on this journey of discovering the history and culture of this land. This is just the beginning. This is book number 1 in the entire series that comprises of, if I'm not wrong, 10 books. Alright, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching.